Hi guys, so this is going to look quite a bit different. Yet again, sorry for the inconsistency. The news of this week that we were not returning to school really set me back mentally and emotionally. So I did not make time to sit down and theme out other green screen ATB breakdowns for this week. So we're just going to go long form, slightly different format, but still breaking it down for you so you guys know exactly what to do. So thank you for understanding. Now, I won't be looking at you the whole time as I have the screen over here that you are currently viewing that we need to go through. So let's get that up and going. So starting with Tuesday, April 14th, problem number 1. In France, there is an uncommon, peaceful kind of farm called a snail farm. Okay, the sound of it is all right, but here's the actual corrected version. In France, there is an uncommon, comma, peaceful kind of farm called a snail farm. All right, so below I've provided a reasoning box so that it can just be really clear the changes I made, why I made them. So when it comes to the use of a versus an in terms of our article words, we've talked about this a couple times in class. When we have consonant sounding words after that article, that will determine which one you use, and in this case we would use a. We had a hard consonant letter sound. However, if you have a vowel sound in the next word, you use an, and in this case we have the u making the sound, so we need to use an. Now, this rule is not always hard and fast for what you would expect. A really good uncommon example of following this rule is the word hour, H-O-U-R, when we're referring to the unit of time. It sounds like a vowel. So we don't say a hour, despite that H being a consonant letter, we say an hour. So just an example, just to kind of concretely illustrate how this rule works. Next, we put a comma between these two descriptive words, also known as, and I put it down here, adjectives. So making sure that you separate them because they're both working to describe, but they're not describing each other. They're not exclusive to each other. So we separate them. And then later on in the sentence, they say a farm. We're not specifically addressing a certain farm. Therefore, that article of a is kind of loose and unnecessary. It would interrupt the entire sound of the last part of this sentence. So we don't need it. You can cut that out, omit it, and we are good. And we are on to number 2. All right. Adult snails lie their eggs in pots of soil, where them develop for weeks. Okay, the sound of this sentence hopefully rung a couple bells for you in your head. Let's go through it. Adult snails lay their eggs in pots of soil where they develop for weeks. Hey, there's some kind of, I think, unintentional rhyming going on. I like it. All right, so the first change we go to. The difference between lie and lay. I found this funny illustration from Grammarly, which is this little extension app that you can put on your browser to help you correct your online writing. I highly recommend it. It's pretty fun. But essentially they illustrate this. You know when to use one of these words in terms of whether they're laying something. In this case, snails are laying eggs. So this illustration is very apt. It's very appropriate. Whereas lie, you're just kind of talking about reclining, right? That's not what we're trying to do here. It also has to do with an issue of tense. So just knowing the irregular tense of these verbs is important. So we're going to go with lay. It's the better option. All right, and then this is a question that's come up in the past, and I think it's a really good question, and I am excited to get to clarify it finally because we don't always have time for these things in class. So the difference between them and they. Them is referring to third person plural. So you're talking about more than one person in an indirect manner, okay? Whereas they helps to refer to the subject pronoun of the clause, and we're interested in using they because our subject noun is going to be eggs. That's what we're talking about. So them is not appropriate, despite there being multiple eggs. It's just about knowing what it is you're trying to accomplish there, with either being indirect with objects or indirect with subjects. So we'll have more time to practice that in the future, and you can always revisit this idea. This will be up on YouTube. So hopefully that helps. And finally, we have a homophone trick, which is always our favorite because we like to clarify it with concrete examples. When they use this form up here, they're kind of using the word to describe strength or lack thereof, whereas we're trying to talk about, the unit of a week or time. So I put some sticky notes of the days of the week to help to illustrate that. So hopefully we know the difference. Despite these sounding the same, they of course mean what? Yes, they mean something different. Okay, on to number 3. All right, we're gonna watch just a short video because I found this, I liked it. It helps to explain it because I know there's been some confusion around what a complex sentence is. So let's take a look.
This video will look at what we mean by the term complex sentence. So what is a complex sentence? Well, it's one that has one independent clause or one or more dependent clauses. Now, an independent clause is one that can stand alone as a sentence, a little bit more on that in a second, and a dependent clause is one that can't stand alone as a sentence. So in this video, the independent clauses are all going to be in blue, and the dependent clauses are all going to be in green.
Blue color coding.
So let's look at our first example. No country can really develop unless its citizens are educated, quote by Nelson Mandela. So you can see here, no country can really develop in blue. That could be a standalone sentence. That's an independent clause. And then appended to that in green is the dependent clause, unless its citizens are educated. So unless its citizens are educated is dependent clause because it can't stand alone as a sentence. Now, an independent clause and a dependent clause are joined with a subordinating conjunction, and we'll look at those a little later. But in this example, unless is the subordinating conjunction. Now, the dependent clause doesn't always come second. Here's the same example with the dependent clause first. This time it starts with the subordinating conjunction. Unless its citizens are educated, no country can really develop. Let's look at another example. Your brain never stops working until you stand up to speak in public.
True.
Your brain never stops working. That could be a sentence. That's why it's in blue. It's the independent clause. And the dependent clause, until you stand up in public, here in green, starts with a subordinating conjunction, until. Remember, the sentence could start with the dependent clause. Here it is. Until you stand up to speak in public, your brain never stops working. Now, when the dependent clause is at the start, you will notice that there's a comma after it. This is a common practice, so it's obvious where the independent clause, the main clause, starts. Now, we spoke about those subordinating conjunctions. Here's a list of common subordinating conjunctions. You will see that there are lots of them. You can pause this video and have a look.
Thanks. We're going to pause that video and have a look. So yeah, we have a lot of these. We've used a lot of these. Main point in the previous example he gives you, it does not necessarily matter whether it's dependent first or independent first, which I think I've kind of mixed up in the past. So I'm sorry if I confused some people, but this even helped clarify for me. You do need a subordinating conjunction, one of these words to offset it that would make it a complex sentence, okay? So in the case of number 3, we're gonna look at this. The baby snails hatch and they live in pens with vegetable plants for food and shelter. Now, the sentence as it exists, as they wrote it, is actually a compound sentence, okay? If I could highlight this in blue in real time, I would. I'll probably figure that out at some point. But the baby snails hatch, if you put a period there, that's an independent clause. Take out the and the comma, they live in pens with vegetable plants for food and shelter, period. So they want a complex sentence. We just have to retool it a little bit and use a subordinating conjunction. The one I chose to use that made the most sense. After, and you notice here it's at the front, here's our dependent clause first. After the baby snails hatch, comma, they live in pens with vegetable plants for food and shelter. So the two are in relation to each other. After as a subordinate clause, a clause that kind of answers to the dependent, helps to kind of set things off here for the complexity of the thought and the arrangement of it. So you could feasibly do it in the reverse, but just make sure that you're using a subordinate conjunction here to help it work. So that's number 3. All right, number 4. So the word we are focused in on is delicacy. Cooked seasoned snails, they're so good, are served as a fine delicacy in French restaurants. Now, I'm not saying go out and find some garden snails and try and do this at home. I'm not saying that. Sorry, don't eat snails from the garden. But if you ever get a chance in the future, maybe try them at a restaurant. I think they're good, but I'm weird, and you guys know that. So the word delicacy, as it's used, refers to a dish or food that is seen as special and or rare, maybe uncommon sometimes. And it can have cultural significance. So the term for the snails that people in France eat is escargot, which just roughly translates to snails. But to them, like, we hear escargot and we're like, oh, France, right? It's a delicacy that's kind of native to France. So that is the 4 problems for Tuesday. We're going to keep going. Like I said, this is a long video. Moving on to Wednesday. Number 1. So we're talking about playing cards in the whole set of these. The Chinese, they probable invent playing cards before the 900s. Ooh, pretty early history, right? So there are a couple of buzzes here. I hope, again, went off in your brain, things that don't sound quite right. The Chinese probably invented playing cards before the 900s. All right. So again, we have this issue of they. We're not looking for a subject pronoun. We're not trying to instate that here. Rather, we're just kind of trying to get to it. And so that is very much interrupting the flow. It does not have a place there. As well, we already have our subject, the Chinese. We know who we are talking about in the case of this sentence, so that we do not need this pronoun, okay? Then we move on to probable versus probably, okay? And I also added invented there. So the word probable is descriptive, or it's an adjective. We're not trying to use an adjectival word here. We're trying to add something on to the verb of invent. So that is why you have ly endings to modify verbs, is that turns them into describing an action, or adverbs. So in this case, probably is describing invented. It's suggesting that this was the action that was taken, and this is the likelihood of that action having happened, okay? And when we get down to invent, we are talking about the 900s, people. It's not like this was yesterday. So we do need to, well, even if it was yesterday, we do need to use the past tense here. So making sure that we add on that ed ending. And that is it for number 1 for Wednesday. Next. Number 2, the Moors, and these are Muslim people, or group of Muslim people that lived in Italy around this time. So in case you didn't know, Google it, I had to. The Moors brought their hand-painted playing cards to Europe around 1370, period. Okay, so I read the corrected version here, whereas we up here have a case of irregular verbs. So the difference between bring and brought. Bring is not the correct tense we're trying to work with, right? We are trying to, yet again, as was the case with number 1, get it the past tense, things that have already happened, and brought's the irregular of bring in the past tense. I say irregular because normally we are used to adding ed on the endings of verbs to change them to past tense. So I put it here, bringed is not a word. So if you've used that in your vocabulary, know now that that is not the proper phrasing, okay? It's not an existing word. Rather, we want to say brought, okay? So that's the reason why we changed that. Then I found this really great illustration that you may or may not have noticed in our classroom that I had by the pencil sharpener forever. The difference between there and there, EIR. This one refers to direction. I love that it's got the little arrow here in case we forget. Whereas there is referring to possession, usually having to do with a person owning something, okay? So that's kind of why they have their little stick figure guy here. And you'll notice in reasoning, I didn't put reasoning for the period, but we have to know where the sentence ends. And I think we've established some mastery with that understanding over time. So on to number 3. All right, I'm sure this one made our brains itch a little bit, and that's good. So we need to fix the misplaced modifier. Now I hear you asking, Ms. Snow, what is a misplaced modifier? Well, I found this really handy definition to help clarify it. So misplaced modifier is a modifier placed so far away from the word it's supposed to modify or change that the intended meaning is unclear or perhaps even humorous. I included some other examples outside of this sentence to just kind of illustrate it. I like the last one the best because I think it's one that we've encountered a couple times. The owner finally found the puppy after he was lost. He could mean the puppy, which is probably what it means. He could also mean the owner. So you see where it kind of starts to get confused. Now, we're not looking at pronouns here in this case. It's a little bit more complex to piece out, but we're going to go into actually looking at what the modifier is. So playing cards made in Europe became popular on printing presses. Okay, so this is suggesting in a way that it's because of the printing presses that playing cards became popular, but that's probably not what they're trying to say. So my rewrite is playing cards made on printing presses in Europe became popular. So aside from that, you're also trying to put the method of making together, okay? So putting this at the end does not make sense. You have to move it with its verb so that it makes sense as to the subject of what it's attached to. And as I said, it kind of reads as though the popular thing is how the cards were made, not the cards themselves. So something to keep in mind, probably a really tricky one, but again, we practice these over time, we will get better at recognizing these things. Okay, and number 4 for Wednesday. We need to pick the appropriate option for a complex sentence. Oh my gosh, it's like we just did that in a previous ATB. Well, now that we have some background knowledge. The original card suites were simplified so that they were easier to print. Oh, hey, here's our friend, the subordinate conjunction, okay? Kind of linking up here, you're not needing to pause, you're not needing a comma. And I illustrated this here so that you guys would know why these two options don't work. Remember, really good reasoning for your thinking can come from eliminating the other possibilities, why you know the other ones are not right. So we have experience with this one. This would make this sentence compound, meaning 2 independent clauses or 2 parts that could be their own sentence if separated with a comma and a conjunction, okay? In this case, we have comma and. We don't want that because we are trying to do complex. And then if you just put but, you have a simple sentence. You have one subject you are talking about, you have one clause, nothing to break up. Again, making sure we pay attention to the directions of what they're trying to go for. So that's it for Wednesday. We have one more, and then you guys will be set free to roam into the discussion. So number 1, me and my family have went to see Stonehenge on vacation last summer. Okay, so we are obviously talking past tense. Keep that in mind. My rewrite is, my family and I went to see Stonehenge on vacation last summer. And if you notice, I kind of imposed Stonehenge in the background here. It is in England. It is this mysterious formation of rocks. The next few problems talk about it a little bit more and give us more information, but I thought it'd be cool to have a visual. So, my family and I. This is something commonly seen and commonly said is me and my family, okay? This is where you would necessarily be making an object of the sentence, whereas we are trying to convey who the subject of the sentence is. And when you are doing that, the I pronouns are always secondary, okay? So you always put other people first in life and in sentences. So remember that. And then the only other change was them putting have in this sentence, okay? If we were trying to say the past tense of go, which is gone, have works well with that particular verb. It does not go with went, okay? And went is already operating under the pretense of it having happened. So this is an unnecessary addition, and it's kind of repeating a little bit. So that's number one. Number two, it's a circle of enormously stones that was built since at least 4,000 years ago. My, oh my, this is wordy. Let's see what we can get rid of, shall we? My correction, it's a circle of enormous stones that was built at least 4,000 years ago. So here's why we did what we did. Again, we have the case of what needs to be describing versus what needs to be adding to an action. We are not interested in doing enormously as an adverb because we don't have a verb here. There's no action right here. Enormous is supposed to describe stones, so you just take off the ly. Build versus built, again, past tense. If we say build, it's more often than not happening like now or, you know, an ongoing process. So we're trying to say past tense that this was built. And finally, since. Now, I actually had to look this up so that I could solidify my explanation a little bit. It was pretty validating, but this word's not usually used when you're talking about large lengths of time. We have 4,000 years ago as a pretty substantial amount of time, but it's also suggesting that we know when this happened definitively. We don't. So saying at least suggests that there's a minimum known amount of time. So we can infer or make our best guess that it was at least 4,000 years ago. We cannot say since because since suggests absolute knowing. So that's number two. You can probably hear my cat meowing right now. So we need to pick the word that suggests the writer is curious out of these two. I chose the mysterious monument sits out in the middle of nowhere. Now, strange. I personally don't have anything against that word. However, it can translate to mean different as a synonym, and that's not always a positive thing. People can see that negatively. So that wouldn't really fit with the suggestion of the writer being curious. Whereas if something's a mystery or mysterious, it suggests that it's something that needs to be solved, something that the subject wants to solve, they're interested in. So that's the more positive out of the two meanings here. And not that they told you that that's what you're going for, but being curious can be a really good thing. So that's number three. And finally, number four. No one knows why it was built, but some speculate, that's our bold word, that it was an observatory. Okay, so if you speculate about something, we've done this a fair amount of times. I imagine you've done it in science as well. If you speculate, you think, you guess, you have a theory, but you don't know exactly. There's any number of ways to think of this, but essentially that's your base definition there for speculating. A lot of people do this, okay? It's just a more complex way of thinking. And that is it for this week. So thank you for going through the longer video. I know that we do this in phases usually, but I appreciate your patience and your flexibility. So hop on over to the discussion, post things about what you did or other questions you still have after going through these 3 days of problems. We'll see you.